Welcome again to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises, the program where we take an intergenerational approach to the book of Revelation. I'm Jon Paulien, and I am professor of religion at Loma Linda University. And with me is
Alfonso Green. I am the senior pastor at the Mount Rubidoux Seventh-day Adventist Church in Riverside, California.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I'm Guilherme Borda, and I am a PhD student in the New Testament at Andrews University.
Awesome. So we have here a collection of perspectives, different ages, etc. And we're going to take a look at the sixth plague in Revelation chapter 16. So if you have a Bible handy or a tablet and stuff, Alfonso here's one of our cutting-edge electronic persons. So just join us with Scripture in any way that you can get it. I've got my trusty old hard copy here, and Revelation 16:12 says, "The sixth angel poured his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east." All right. One thing I've often noticed about Revelation is it isn't hard to know sometimes what John is saying, but it can be really hard to understand what he means. All right, what is he saying here? Sixth angel has a bowl, pours it out on the river Euphrates. The river Euphrates, magically it seems, dries up, and that makes room for these kings from the east. All right, so that's, not too complicated. The only question is, what on earth does it mean?
Right.
All right. So when you come to that kind of conundrum, what I've often recommended is three things. Number one, check how that symbol is utilized elsewhere in the book of Revelation. Second, see whether that's taken somewhere from the Old Testament. And much of Revelation is defined in the Old Testament. And then third, see how that same language plays in the New Testament. And I love this verse because there's three issues here, and they will take us to all three background places. So let me throw a question at the two of you right off the stop. Euphrates River, is that the Euphrates River, or does it represent something else? And if so, what? Drying up the Euphrates River, is that literal or is it figurative? What do we do with the images here? Should we take them literally or figuratively, and why?
Yeah. Well, when we look at the historical context in the Old Testament, we find that the river Euphrates was there, and there's Babylon, and then the enemy was able to come in through that way that the river would come in the city. So the drying up of the river Euphrates is the exposing or the making Babylon fragile and exposed, open, vulnerable. It is the preparation for its fall, its demise. It's the end of this power. It is coming near. Because through that way, then, it says here, so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. So basically, just as Babylon fell and the river was involved in that fall, how people were able to access through that way. Also, then the river can be dried, so then that system can be impacted, attacked.
So I was just going to just piggyback off of that, just maybe give a little bit more historical context for maybe those viewers that may not be even aware of how this was even set up. So ancient city of Babylon, one of the great cities in the ancient world, the river Euphrates ran directly through it. It was a source of economic vitality and life for the city. The city could not survive without that river. So what you're referring to is when that city was taken over, when they came and they were able to take the city down, they stopped the water, diverted it, went under, and were able to conquered the city of Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon that night. So it was a source of life and vitality for that city. And so by it drying up, if it ever did dry up in the ancient world, that city would essentially die.
So you think then that the reference to Euphrates here is probably connected to the beast of the previous one, which, at least eventually will be recognized as Babylon itself. So one aspect, the Euphrates River is not just a river. And by the way, when I asked the question, is it literal or symbolic? I would argue symbolic for a very simple reason. The first plague falls on the world, the earth. Second plague falls on the oceans, the whole world. Rivers and springs, the sun, baking everybody. So, seed of the beast, that's smaller than the first four. But this one, the plague, drying up a river. I mean, that doesn't seem big enough. It's way too small. It's got to represent something bigger. And we'll dig into that and get a little bit further. So one thing you both brought out is that mentioning the Euphrates River recalls Babylon. But I'd suggest something else. There's another element in the Old Testament that Euphrates was the northern border of the kingdom of Israel, at least in God's mind. God says, I have given you from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. So from the Nile to the Euphrates, this whole span of territory God intended his people to expand into. That would have made them a superpower in the ancient world. They'd have been as large as Babylon or Egypt was. So that's, that was in God's plan. But the Euphrates River then is in the minds of the people the boundary between Israel and hostile nations. The drying up of the river is getting rid of a barrier that is protecting on one side and maybe threatening to get rid of it on the other. So here you have the Euphrates River dried up so that it can be crossed, probably for nefarious purposes under most cases.
Do you think that this is symbolizing just one or the other? Do you think these two aspects of the invasion of Babylon, also with the river and the water being diverted, could be at play? Or do you think it is that issue of the border being removed of protection? Do you think it could be both in the background of this symbolism here?
Well, you've been studying the book for a while. What do you think? Does Revelation sometimes collate
I think sometimes
opposites?
it does bring together different strings and then weaves them into one chord for its message.
Yeah, so he can use a variety of images sometimes and weave them together, and sometimes one image can mean two things. All right, let's be open to that then. As we go forward, is Euphrates here primarily because of his connection with Babylon, or is it also here because of its connection with Israel? You see, that it was a protection for Israel, but it's also a protection for Babylon. Babylon's in the middle of a desert. It almost never rains. I haven't been in that part of the world, but I can tell you Sinai is not a blade of weed in that place. It is so dry, so extremely dry. And if it was not for the Euphrates River coming down from the mountains of Turkey and southern Europe, Babylon couldn't exist. So you're absolutely right, I think, in the things that you've been saying about that. So let's keep those images in mind. This is going to be one of those rich texts that really take us in a number of places. So we may accumulate some evidence first before we try to make sense of it.
Yeah, just one thing I would say is that if Babylon is a system that professes to be of God, right? We explored in chapter 13 the idea of a false trinity, right? It's some sort of anti-trinity. The dragon, the sea beast, and the land beast, and how there's aspects that in a sense, falsify the movement of Christ or falsify the religion of the true God and presents an alternative. The connection with Babylon and Israel could be both true, because at the end it will be a movement professing to be of God, but it professes to be the people of God, but it is Babel. It is a persecuting power against God, right? So maybe.
Now, if there's some younger skeptics watching the program, you just made some big claims there. You know, here's truth, here's error, and I know where it is. What would you say to somebody who says, who gave you the right to do that?
Well,
see, Alfonso, we don't mess around.
Yeah, no, sure.
Clearly.
No, that's fair. That's par for the course.
Yeah.
So the scriptures, throughout the scriptures, you see notions of false religiosity, human attempts at doing religion that God rejects. In fact, you even have the notion that God does not seem to listen to every prayer. You have in, I believe it's Isaiah 1, that God is basically, he's had enough of their prayers, of these people that they profess to be the people of God, but they oppress people left and right. They do evil left and right, and now they want to come and pray to God. Go back, stop oppressing people, go back, stop doing these things, and then you go and pray. So there are often, and I think that people would relate to that, when we see atrocities of people who, in the name of Christ, present a false gospel. Let's think, for example, about prosperity gospel, which is one of the atrocities that people be familiar with, right?
I mean, you're still using that language, you know, right. False and stuff like that, and somebody who hasn't quite immersed themselves.
My point is that if someone questions, like, who are you to say that there are religions that are false? My point is that from the perspective of the scriptures, that this book that we're studying belongs to, God does not validate or affirm every religion. There are religions that lead people away from God. So it is understandable that people would be skeptical of religion, because there are many religious efforts out there that actually lead people away from God. Think about, for example, prosperity gospel. Professes to be the gospel of Christ. It isn't. It is a gospel for your own gain, for your own enrichment, rather than having Christ at the center of it. It's just, and taking it no matter what happens. And it's a distortion. So I understand that sometimes people get very skeptical about religion. What I'm saying is there is such a thing as false and true religion. So that understandable skepticism that people have of religion, I am on the same page with them when it comes to the false religion. My point is, but there is a true manifestation of religion too. And what the book of Revelation presents to us is that God, agrees with people when they reject false religious. But that doesn't mean we should reject all religiosity. There is such a thing as true religion as well.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, what I would say to the person that may be a skeptic or somebody that may struggle with whether or not they can rest their hat on any type of religious truth, like how do we know this is truth? I think that we would all concede that there are truths in other areas that we have no problem resting our hat on. There are scientific truths that all of us are comfortable with. And so could it be possible that if there are truths in these other areas and other spheres of life, could there also be religious truths? And in the same way that there's truths in these other areas, and if we can concede that there are truths in the areas of religion, then the issue really is, am I humble enough? It's about my posture. If I acknowledge that there's truth there, yes, hey, how do we know for certain? Well, there's a truth, but we're approaching it with a spirit of humility, saying that, you know what, there is truth, but I'm seeking after. I'm a fellow student like everyone else, and we're all trying to arrive at what we believe is absolute truth in this particular area as we're looking at religion. So I think really, if we're talking to somebody, say, hey, look, I'm a fellow traveler on this road with you, but I do believe we can arrive at a destination, but we have to be humble in the journey.
A couple of thoughts. One is this. The Bible seems to teach a cosmic conflict which covers the entire universe, every nation, every planet, every religion, every political party, every individual, So God is at work in all of these, and Satan's at work in all of these. So one perhaps slightly balancing perspective, Guillermo, to what you were saying, is to recognize that God has not given up on what you have called false religion, all right? And what you have called true religion, Satan hasn't given up on either. So we want to keep that in mind, that there's a tussle everywhere we go. At the same time, though, does that mean that all roads lead to the same place?
No. Yeah.
This is my testimony, okay? My answer to the question is that I think the Bible is different in this way. Most religions were started by good men who really cared about people, cared about the divine, were seeking to make the world a better place, etc. So there are often very good motives there. Christianity was not started by a good man. That's the difference. Because the man who started Christianity claimed to be God. So he's not a good man if he was wrong, right? So the fact that Jesus claims to be God in person, come to this earth, puts the entire scripture to the test. It cannot be, Christianity is in a different place than most other religions because it claims a unique happening in universal history. And so what I would share to those who are more skeptical or so on is check it out. Check out the story of Jesus. Is his claim true or is it not? If it is true, then this book is the most important thing you could ever do, is reading this book, understanding this book, living by this book. Now, that's the commitment I see in my colleagues here, not seeking to diminish anybody else. And as I said, God is at work in all these religions. So there's something to be gained, something to be learned, something to listen to. But if the claim of Jesus is true, then there's something unique about biblical faith that needs to be taken seriously. And if it's true, I believe one can demonstrate historically that if Jesus had never lived, we would not have cell phones, we would not have universities, we wouldn't have hospitals as we know them today, because the teachings of Jesus filtered through the centuries that followed and brought us to this place. Now that's a huge claim, all right, but I'm willing to back that up with actual history. Jesus is the most amazing person who ever lived. If he's not God, who is he? How'd that happen? You see? So I have confidence in what the scriptures say about Jesus, but don't intend by any way to disrespect anyone else who has not yet come to that conviction. But if you haven't, I encourage you to open the Word for yourself and ask, if there is a God, are you in this? What do I need to do with this?
Yeah. The three angels' messages, right, that we find in chapter 14, they have this global invitation for everyone and anyone who would like to join the true religion of worshiping the Creator, right, rather than the creature. And then a condemnation of the system that is here being impacted by this plague, right? So here in the plagues, we see more the judgment upon them and the wrath of God and what happens in the coming apart of these systems, of this system here of false religion. But in the three angels' messages, you have both sides of it, both the invitation to give glory to God and to worship Him who is the Creator, and the warning, both that serves both as a warning of the punishment that is to come, and because of that too, as a warning of don't be in that system. God is inviting, the Spirit of God is working throughout the world with people of all kinds of different religions, inviting them to worship the Creator God, their Creator who loves them, who cares for them.
The interesting thing is that even when you get to the final end, God can say to Babylon, come out of her, my people. So Babylon has genuine people. So there are people who may be in any system of this world that God is working with. But at the same time, if the claim of Jesus is true, then all paths are not equal. And that's the decision I think everyone has to make.
I will say, I really liked the way you framed that for the secular person. Just the individuals that I meet on a regular basis, it's very difficult to approach them with just that, hey, this is the way.
Yeah.
But to be able to say to them, hey, look, just historically, here's some things, try it. Here's some things that are unique about the man Jesus that's different than any other of the religious systems we have, and allowing the Holy Spirit to step in. And then also, we talked about in a previous episode, just really being that example, that light for people, and they can actually see in your life what it looks like to follow Jesus. That's where that drawing comes. So I really appreciated that. It was an excellent way to frame it.
Part of what I wanted to point out is that false systems of religion, part of the reason why they have to be opposed is that they lead people away from God, right? So think about, for example, the Apostle Paul. He was clearly very upset with the people who thought that the Galatians needed to be circumcised to be accepted as full heirs of Abraham, full members of the family, to have full fellowship. He was so upset. He basically said, I wish those circumcised would cut it off. Basically, he wished they would castrate themselves. That's how upset he was. He tells the Galatians, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? He sees this as so serious because they're putting a barrier between people and God that God has not put there. They're blocking. That's why Jesus also was turning tables in the temple, because he was so upset because people were putting walls between God and people that God never put there. So there are things that God establishes, and it's okay to affirm those. But there are things that people put there between God and people, God and the seeker, that God hates. Why does God hate that? Because that is crushing the spirit of this person. It's crushing their hopes. It is telling them, you have no access to God but through this, but that is a lie. And this system is what does that too. This false system of Babylon, this system of the beast that for centuries did that to people, oppressed them, killed people who were in favor, or who were trying to be faithful to God, tried to raise walls that were not there. You can only go through here, and then put a wall. And that is something absolutely oppressive, abhorrent, demonic. And that's why this system has to come down. And so I say it with passion because there are people out there that are dying in this world, and they think they have no hope because they have been taught a way of false religion, a way that crushes their hearts, crushes their hopes, crushes their spirit. But Jesus is saying, come to me.
There's a way that seems right to a man or a woman.
Yes.
And the end thereof is the way of death. Proverbs.
Yes.
We have just a few minutes left, but I'd like to get started with John's interpretation of the Euphrates River. And we saw the Euphrates River is central to this verse. Let's go to chapter 17 and verse 1. It says, one of the seven angels that held the seven bowls came and spoke to me and said, come, I will show you the judgment on the great whore enthroned above the ocean. All right? So you have one of the seven bowl angels comes to John. And it's clearly having to do with water in some sense, because it's sitting on waters. It says ocean here in my translation, but it's simply waters in the original. Which of the plagues has water in it?
Well, you have the second and the third. They have the sea and the springs of water, and then you have the sixth bull.
Right. Right. So there's 3 of the 7 plagues have something to do with water. So that we're narrowing it down. But which angel is coming here in chapter 17? Well, if you identify the whore or the prostitute, look at verse 5. On her forehead was a name with a secret meaning, Babylon the Great. So in verse 1 of chapter 17, Babylon is sitting on waters. That's the Euphrates River. All right? So the Euphrates River is going to be explained in chapter 17. And with a shortage of time, let's just jump right to verse 15. And in verse 15, he said to me, the waters you saw where the great whore sits. All right, what's that? Verse 1, right? The waters you saw is an ocean of peoples, populations, nations, and languages. So does the Euphrates River represent the Euphrates River? No.
No.
Does it represent Iraq?
No.
No. Does it represent Saddam Hussein?
No.
No. It represents worldwide collection of political, military, economic, civil power. So we will learn over time that Babylon, I think you've already suggested this, Babylon has strong religious connotations, false religion type connotations, but it's supported by the Euphrates River of the political secular powers of the world. So in the 6th plague, when the bowl dries up the Euphrates, it's doing something to the whole world. This plague is not simply drying up a river. It's an attack on the entire system of things, nations and peoples and languages, etc. So when we pick up again next time, we're going to come back to chapter 16:12 and follow this through and say, what is this drying up of the Euphrates River all about, and what could it possibly mean for God's people at the end of time? This has been GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises. See you again next time.